Hello, hello, and welcome. Welcome, everyone. Hello and welcome to this lesson on Othello for My Edspace's Key Stage 5 English course. This is one of our completely free streams available to you for free across this year, as we will be looking at the most common A-level texts and looking at how to analyze them, how to argue them, all about the context and critical theory that's most commonly used to talk about them, all coming to you for free from My Edspace's resources. Hi, Steve. Welcome to the lesson today. Thank you for joining us. So this is lesson 12 of our series on Shakespeare's Othello, one of the most common A-level texts. And we are going to be looking at this theme of masculinity and femininity today. If this is your first time joining us, I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the English teachers at My Edspace. I will be providing these free streams across the year for A-level English. This is not limited to any one specific exam board or specification. This will be relevant to you if you're studying Othello, regardless of which exam board you are taking. Of course, make sure to check with your teacher this, because it is important that you know for yourself to organise your own revision and thinking. But for us, we're thinking more about the text itself. So these ideas will still be relevant to you. If this is your first time as well, in the description below, there will be a PDF of the workbook that I've made specifically for this lesson so that you can follow along and use it to annotate, to write your own notes, to revise, and to have in front of you as we work through, so that you can leave with a really nice set of notes that will help you in your future pursuits. Those just joining, welcome, welcome. So let's get started on this theme of masculinity and femininity. If anyone is new, this is me. By the way, I'm Eleanor. And what we're going to do, for those of you who have taken one of these lessons before, we're going to start with a review of what you know about Jacobean masculinity and femininity, and some ideas linked to this theme that are important in order for us to get into the theme itself. So feel free to put into the chat. It is accessible for you. Feel free to put questions, answers, comments into the chat so that we can have a bit more of a discussion, so that you can ask any questions you'd like to over the course of this lesson. And let's continue from there. So, for example, what were the tenets of Jacobean masculinity? This is thinking about what were the important elements of Jacobean masculinity. Jacobean, of course, referring to the time period of Shakespeare's writing and performing of Othello, which was during King James I's rule. So let's have a think. Masculinity, what did this look like in the Jacobean era? Well, there were these ideas of power and of control, with having to do with defining who you were as a man, as well as dominance, physical strength. M11, hello. Potency, Steve, 100%. And I'm going to add to that virility as well. So this idea of being sexually virile, being able to have children, being not impotent is kind of the phrase we hear more, is the idea of impotence. Here we have this idea of potency here. Tenets, M11 meaning kind of the elements, the key points of Jacobean masculinity. We also have this idea of reputation here, of course. And as we've looked at in previous lessons, reputation has to do particularly with control of oneself and control of one's household. So particularly the women within one's household. With this, we also have ideas of heterosexuality here. Not to say that we can't read any of these characters through a queer lens, because we absolutely can. There is lots of basis for criticism analysing Iago and Othello as well in terms of their sexual jealousy for each other, or for Cassio as well. Misogyny, Steve, yes, to a certain point. I don't think people were seeking out to be misogynistic, but certainly that was the effect of this masculinity, this idea of thinking that men are more important than women. And this partly has to do with the fact that there was a deep difference between the view of men and the view of women at the time. So this idea of men and men being fundamentally, chemically, physically different than women. What do I mean by this? I mean that this is stemming from ancient Greek medicine, really, of the idea of men were controlled by their brains and women were controlled by their uterus. So their kind of center of thought and center of being was controlled by their brain and women's by their uterus. So this idea that in terms of friendship, that men could really only see eye to eye with other men and could really only share their whole selves and love as equals between two different men. So this idea of male friendship being really important, a relationship being between a woman and a man is more simplistic because they viewed women to be less complicated creatures. So the idea that they couldn't share their lives in such an intimate and equitable way between a man and a woman. With this as well, we have heroic behavior in war, for example, M11. Absolutely. This idea of heroism and bravery, of course. Also alongside this is this idea of dignity here and eloquence. So this idea of being well-spoken, of being dignified, of having a good head on one's shoulders, of having self-control as well as control over others as well, of having influence over others. So there's quite a lot here, right? Then let's think about femininity and what this looks like. Femininity. For femininity, first and foremost, we have this idea of purity. Purity both morally, but also fundamentally, physically, in terms of virginity. Here as well, we have beauty, of course. And if we think about the reasons for this, perhaps the idea of physiognomy comes to mind. This idea, a pseudoscience, it's now been proved, but a belief that people's outsides match their insides. So their external beauty was a reflection of their moral character, which means that if someone is beautiful, then they are good. And this was, of course, another expectation for women, this idea of moral goodness. Because women were expected to be the moral center of their family. So, for example, women were taught to read so that they could read the Bible to their children, be able to impart these messages. Lacking equality compared to men, M11, 100%. This idea, as Steve said as well, of submission. Submissiveness, obedience, etc. That also links to this idea then of passivity. So women are not meant to be passionate, are not meant to be outgoing, are not meant to be seeking out or really even enjoying the idea of love. This paleness that's attributed to Desdemona at the beginning and then also in her death is also linked to this idea of coldness, which speaks to the Jacobean expectation of women as expecting to be passive, because passivity was linked to chastity. This idea of they're not seeking out love or not acting on love or not experiencing passion because that would be lustful. And women are supposed to just be receiving love and desire from men. They're not meant to feel it at all. So if they do, that is an implication that the woman is out of control, that she's had her passions kind of ignited. So passivity then links to this idea of femininity. Here as well, Steve said they're meant to be objects. Yes, so here now we're thinking about this idea of them serving a transactional purpose for the men in their life, as in women were born, as M11 said, for marriage. This was their role in society, was marriage and children. And in what way is this transactional? Well, one was exchanged, a woman would be exchanged, and essentially her virginity would be exchanged between a father and a suitor. And this gave power to both men, because the father was then associated with this suitor, who supposedly for someone like Desdemona would be someone powerful with lots of resources that Brabantio, for example, would want to align himself with. And for the suitor, this would be a rise in power because they would gain not only the wife, but also the ability to have children through this virginal vessel that would provide him with, because she's a virgin, unquestionably his and legitimate progeny. And then we also have this idea of a dowry coming with her, right? So this idea of exchanging goods here, so that both men gain more power in society, and the woman just serves this role in between them. Also thinking, as Steve said, this idea of naivete, right? They're not meant to know anything about sex or men or relationships. They're not meant to know how to flirt. If they do, it's a concern, because that's not an expectation for them. Next, who was expected to be the active pursuer in a Jacobean relationship? This was exclusively the man. Passive object of desire. And there we marry both Steve and M11's ideas of passivity and objectification together here. Were they supposed to be as temptation? M11, good point. So we're going to get to that with the Madonna-whore dichotomy, so I'll save that for just one moment. So here we are, we have this kind of one-sided relationship that we know is subverted in Othello and Desdemona's relationship. Because it's Desdemona who pursues him, who makes her feelings plain. She's not meant to. In fact, women were expected to decline marriage invitations or marriage proposals first, as a sign of them not being too eager or too keen. Now, this Madonna-whore dichotomy. A dichotomy, firstly, is this split into two. Di meaning two, like diameter, split into two. And these are the division of femininity into two diametrically, which means completely opposite archetypes. An archetype is like the idea of a character, the form of a character. So, for example, the villain, the damsel in distress, the hero, etc. And these are the Madonna and the whore. The Madonna is Madonna being a reference to the Virgin Mary, who was miraculous for her idea of being a mother whilst also being pure. There's this idea of passivity here, innocence, etc., holiness, divinity here. And this was the ideal to which someone like Desdemona is held. For example, we see that Cassio calls her divine Desdemona. We have images of white attached to her as in innocence and purity. We have even Othello idealizing her, describing her in terms of a statue, describing her as this kind of angelic cherubim there. And then here we have the whore, who is this biblical Eve figure. And this is where we get to this idea of temptation, M11. Because Eve is known for the downfall of mankind, and mankind I'm using intentionally because it was blamed that women were blamed for the destruction of men, that they were tempters, that they were sexual aggressors, that they were impure, that they were destructive, and that they would lead a man to his ruin. So if any of you have studied, for example, Thomas Hardy's The Ruined Maid, this idea of a woman who's been ruined and the idea of her dragging someone down with him. So these are our two different characters here. Across the trajectory of the play, we have Desdemona as the Madonna, then moving in the consciousness of the play, both in the eyes of the other characters and in Othello's eyes, to this whore character, because she's out of control, because she's uncontrollable, because she cuckolds him, because she is in charge, because she is bringing about his downfall. And then when she's destroyed, when she's killed by Othello, she's brought back to this idea of being a Madonna again, because she is proved innocent. So this idea of her being pure and perfect again, this pearl richer than all his tribe. M11, placing blame to females is prevalent. Yes, you could say it's institutional here because we're using Jacobean Christianity, and I say Jacobean Christianity because it's a kind of perversion of the ideas of true Christianity, right? This idea of women being this kind of destructive force. But at the time, Christianity was used to support the subjugation of women, that control, the limitations placed on women. And then what's considered most harmful to a man's reputation? Here is cuckoldry, which means a wife's infidelity. Because it was seen as a man being unable to assert his dominance over a woman, or over his woman, it was viewed. And any house in which a woman was in control, a man was thought of as a cuckold, as someone who's not able to keep his place and keep control of what he's meant to. Any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Let's take a look a little bit deeper at women's role in Jacobean England. I'm going to read, and then I want you to, from that blue box, just put your answers in perhaps bullet point format in the chat. what aspects of this Jacobean womanhood that I'm going to describe appear in the play. Women in Jacobean England had very little agency. Their lives were determined by their fathers and later by their husbands. Marriages would then be arranged by a father, and the match would prioritize the power, wealth, or influence gained by the families over the love between the couple. Single women, then, were viewed as transactional, as their bodies, and chiefly their virginity, were exchanged as goods for power and to provide legitimate descendants. Thus, a woman's virginity became her sole indicator of value. Al-Hibri, a feminist theorist, argues that having a son means immortality because he is the source to carry on the family name, and the role of women within the patriarchal society is that of an incubator. Think, what's an incubator? An incubator is a place, for example, where chicken or duck eggs are kept, like a box, a warm box where they are used to nurture the eggs into forming hatchlings. And so this idea of kind of an almost oven-esque warming place, a container for children to grow in, for a son to grow in. Marriage was the only way in which women gained agency, as married women were granted more freedoms and status than single women. However, this agency was for the most part confined to specific feminine spheres of influence, chiefly the home. For example, it is inside that scenes in which Desdemona and Emilia exhibit sororal bonds take place, as the more experienced wife Emilia shares marital knowledge with the young Desdemona and offers advice for wives on how to get what they want from their husbands. It is here, too, that Othello and Desdemona discuss their marriage without overt external influence. It is only here, and not in public, that Desdemona can exercise some influence over her husband, and is perhaps why Cassio calls her my captain's captain. However, marriage also made a woman and her dowry the property of her husband. Women were also considered the weaker sex who needed both physical and moral protection from their husband, a belief that stemmed from the fall of the biblical Eve. The husband was considered head of house and had to provide for his wife and their children. Though husbands were responsible for chastising an erring wife, they were not allowed to be cruel or abusive. Thus, when Iago warns Othello of Desdemona's previous defiance of her father's in her marriage, he is reminding Othello of his responsibility for curbing a young wife's potential defiance as part of his role as a respectable husband. We can see this social pressure's influence in Othello's own speech, as he describes Desdemona's alleged infidelity as just grounds for her murder. In other words, the justifiable reason for her murder. So what aspects of this appear in the play? Pop it into the chat. This idea of the women's role. What do we see in the play that links to Jacobean femininity? Well, first we have this idea of little agency, right? And their idea that fathers and husbands controlled women's fate. We do have this idea as well of marriage meant to be arranged by a father to prioritize these things, which perhaps suggests why Brabantio and Othello's relationship is so unusual. It's because their marriage goes against and subverts and resists these expectations. It's not arranged by the father, rather secretly behind his back in the middle of the night. Question is the one in blue just above me. What aspects of Jacobean womanhood appear in the play? And perhaps this is why he's so furious, as we've seen in a previous lesson where we looked at a model paragraph in which this was included. This idea of Brabantio's loss of control is because he loses the power, wealth, and influence gained by Desdemona's good marriage when she marries Othello instead. Thus, we can see women viewed as transactional, this focus on virginity here as for power and descendants for men, and a woman's virginity being her chief indicator of value, right? So as soon as Othello and Brabantio think of Desdemona as not having her virginity anymore, particularly in the circumstances in which they both think she has lost it, we have this idea of her not having value to them. We can see this because Brabantio essentially writes her off, and Othello falls out of love with her and then kills her within the space of 2 days. Alhibri's idea as well of this idea of women being an incubator for men, and that this is their only source of power, and that for women, power being virginity, it's because it's important to men in terms of preserving their name. We also have this idea of marriage as a way that women gain agency. She's able to convince Othello of things, for example, that she should be able to go to Cyprus. She's allowed to do that, whereas if she was unmarried, she definitely would not. But we also have this idea of, as Cassio says, of her being my captain's captain, because she, as well as the other characters, think that she will be able to influence Othello's decision about Cassio's job. However, we also have this idea of feminine spheres of influence. So Emilia and Desdemona talking together is inside within this more intimate feminine space, where Emilia shares marital knowledge to Desdemona and gives advice. It's also here that Desdemona is shown to have any influence over her husband, is when she is not sort of playing up, or he is not playing up to the society that's watching them, but rather that they're speaking more intimately. This is when he feels he cannot murder her because he loves her too much, until, of course, he's pushed. Then as well, we have this idea of her being the property of her husband, and that she needs protection from her husband here, because otherwise she will be morally corrupt. She won't be able to exist as a intact, pure woman without the control and oversight of a man. With this, we're thinking of husbands being responsible for chastising wives as well, as Othello does take this very sort of parental tone with her as he speaks to her about what she's done wrong. When he says, "Have you prayed tonight? Your hand is hot." This idea of are you lying to me? This kind of way that he speaks to her that seems very much in a power dynamic, almost of parent and child, rather than as equals, certainly. And he seems condescending, as she is so innocent. Remember, the age difference between them would be something like 20 years, because she is meant to be probably around 13 or 14. Iago says that he is in his early 20s, perhaps 23, and Othello is 40, because Iago says he's nearly double his age. So we have this idea of the dynamic between them. But also we have Othello using these tenets of Jacobean femininity and the expectations that he knows that all of these characters are aware of, in order to provoke Othello as part of this, saying, well, she defied her father, you better keep control of her, because clearly she is not able to be controlled here. She's able to deceive her father. She's able to transgress his wishes. She's able to resist her role in Jacobean/Venetian society. What makes you think that she will be submissive to you? And we can see that Othello is affected by this as well, perhaps even more so because he's an outsider, already aware of his precarious position in society. But we can see that he submits to these pressures because he thinks of her supposed infidelity as causing her murder in a way. Then briefly, the Madonna-whore dichotomy, because we've already covered it a little bit, but just a bit more detail for you. The Madonna-whore dichotomy describes the idea of women being perceived as one of two opposite archetypes. The Madonna, pure, virtuous, innocent, Mary-like caregiver, or a whore, a sexualized, seductive, and corrupting woman. As upper-class women were in particular used transactionally for the purposes of contributing noble lines, their virginity was prized. Often virginity tests were part of the marriage ceremony, and the evidence of a consummated marriage was observed by both families and exhibited as the sign of a lawful marriage. So this is the idea of, as part of the marriage ceremony, the couple was escorted into the bedroom, the curtains were drawn around the bed, the marriage was consummated whilst everyone sort of witnessed that outside, and then the sheets were checked if there was blood on it to prove that she were a virgin. Then, particularly in cases of nobility, this was displayed to everyone to show this is a consummated marriage. These two families are now united. This now counts as a marriage. They're officially wed. Let's keep carrying on with these celebrations. This could also be put out of a window, for example, in a castle to show that the consummation had happened. These two families were joined. Ensuring paternity was key in preserving inheritance and bloodlines. So any suggestion of infidelity on the parts of a woman was grounds for termination of the marriage. The marriage would not be counted if this virginity test was failed. It would be considered not having taken place at all. Women who did not fulfill this expectation would be sentenced to social ruin and not welcome in polite society. In Othello, we can see this most clearly in the starkly different treatment of Desdemona and Bianca, the alleged sex worker. Critics can use this term to describe the duality of fantasies of femininity imposed on women by patriarchal values. The reductive nature of this binary denies women complexity or agency, as it forces them to embody only one of these archetypal figures. Thus, Cassio cannot see Bianca as a potential wife, and when Desdemona is proved, so-called, unfaithful, Othello cannot see the woman he loved, but merely a mask of artifice and deception. So this idea of the bifurcation between Desdemona and Bianca, but then when Othello suspects her, she becomes a Bianca to him, made most clear, as we saw on Wednesday, in that mini board scene of treating Desdemona as if she were a sex worker and Emilia as a pimp. Jacobeans also believed in the pseudoscience of physiognomy, as I mentioned, in which a person's external appearance was determined by and reflective of their moral character. Part of the anxieties about appearance in Othello reflects the concern that Desdemona's external beauty and seeming purity, her paleness in particular, might mask her adultery and deception. So literal blemishes on people's face were meant to be indications of their blemishes and their sins internally. And interesting, we have these three parallel couples: Othello and Desdemona, Iago and Emilia, and Cassio and Bianca, who we will return to in a minute. Now, masculinity. So the men of Jacobean England were defined by their reputation. Women helped to define this reputation as their behavior reflected on their husband's control of the household. So this is the flip side of that earlier idea. Thus, there was an obsession with women's chastity that engendered anxiety and violence within men. Masculine spheres of influence included the battlefield, the courtroom, and the public sphere. Indeed, Othello is most eloquent when speaking in front of a crowd, much more so than when speaking in an intimate setting with Desdemona or Iago about personal matters. So interesting, that idea of public versus private. If you're thinking about a question about setting, that would serve you so well. Indeed, Emilia and Desdemona's presence in the masculine sphere of Cyprus, the rough boundary between civilization and uncivilized chaos, potentially is one of the reasons for this instability and fear that acts as an undercurrent throughout the play. This suggests how much Jacobean masculinity depended on performativity and appearance. So this idea of looking masculine, looking macho, looking in control and powerful. For more about Cyprus and setting, see our previous lesson on it. Then cuckoldry, or being a cuckold, describes a wife's infidelity towards her husband. The popular image of a horned man was particularly popular on Jacobean stages. Many explanations exist about the horns themselves. One is that a horned creature cannot see their own horns, just as a cuckolded man is usually unaware of his wife's infidelities, even if everyone else knows. Regarded as the weaker sex, men were immediately distrustful of women's ability to control themselves sexually and morally. The damage cuckolding would do to a man's reputation would be severe. As Greenblatt, who's a critic, describes, it was the most horrible of sins, more detestable than homicide or plunder. So worse than killing someone. Thus, in the Jacobean mind, it justified severe and mortal punishment against the woman who had caused this social homicide. So then thinking about what Desdemona supposedly does to Othello is the equivalent of murdering him in terms of his reputation, murdering him socially. Why then would he act so forcefully? Because he is being destroyed, and he, as a black man in Venice, is already in such a precarious position. Interestingly, in the blue box above me, this is from Fancy's Egg Fits or Beauty's Nettlebed, which is a pamphlet from 1599, quoted, where we have this idea of jealousy was felt more severely by men than women because, and this is not mistyping, this is the spelling of the pamphlet from 1599, he feels withal a shame and infamy with such a blemish and dishonour as in no way or at any time repayable again. So this idea of shame and infamy with jealousy or with this threat to a reputation as a blemish or dishonour that cannot be fixed ever, is irreparable. And now let's look at masculinity and femininity, shall we? So here we have a lot of different ideas about masculinity here. Othello saying a horned man's a monster and a beast. So this idea then of cuckoldry, a horned man, and monstrosity being linked. Othello also saying, I will chop her into messes, cuckold me. This idea of violence as immediate consequence for even the question of cuckoldry is vicious violence. Othello also says to be once in doubt is to be once resolved. This idea of if he doubts Desdemona's faithfulness once, he has to make up that's his decision made. He has to act. He also says Desdemona was covered by the slime that sticks on filthy deeds. This is his justification for murdering her, is saying this. So this idea of filth, she is tarnished, she's dirtied his reputation. If we think about white and darkness and filth in this play, there is so much there to think about. Again, I'll tear her all to pieces. So this idea of immediate violence and destruction of women in order to define and protect masculinity. He also says, if I do prove her haggard, though that her jesses were my dear heartstrings, I'd whistle her off and let her down the wind to prey at fortune. She's gone, I'm abused, and my relief must be to loathe her. O curse of marriage that we can call these delicate creatures ours and not their appetites. So what does this mean? This means if I prove her unfaithful, even if the strings that attach us, so kind of like a leash that I have on her, were my own heartstrings, literal strings of my heart, I'd cut them off and let her fly off to her own fate. Could this be a reference to perhaps the thread of fate in Greek mythology and this idea of cutting it as cutting off her life? Yes. There is also this idea perhaps of falconry, right? And the leash attached to a falcon, him sending the falcon off, but cutting the leash so that it can't make its way back and is just up to its own fate. This idea of letting her loose, cutting her loose, but there is a violence within that as well. And even though this was his own heart, so they're thinking about the effect on him as well, but he's so willing, if he can prove her unfaithful, to destroy her immediately. And the same, my relief must be to loathe her. So if she's gone, the only thing that will make me feel better is hating her. And this curse of marriage that we can call the delicate creatures ours. So this idea that we can have these women, we can call them ours, but we can't control their appetites. By that they mean sexual appetites. So we can control them, but not their lusts, in other words. And then there's that idea then of control with masculinity as well. That is important. And I can see social pressure as well, M11. Yes, 100% with masculinity, because it is performed, right? If masculinity is a social construct, then it must be performed. Same Othello, yet she must die, or else she'll betray more men. My wife, what wife? I have no wife. This is from Act 5, Scene 2. And this idea of forceful language, right? And the consequences if he does not kill her. Not that he'll forgive her, not that they can start again, not that he'll never get over it, but that he is doing this in order to save other men from destruction as well. So he sees her influence as destructive towards men. And the idea that once he has decided about her infidelity, the bond is broken here. And we can see this fixation with him here as well in terms of his wife, this immediately cutting off here. Othello also says, damn her, lewd minx, oh damn her, come, go with me apart, I will withdraw to furnish me some swift means of death for the fair devil. So this idea of thinking of her as damned, so sending her to hell, damning her to hell, and he wants some quick way to kill this fair devil. Then we also have this idea of her presentation as well, if she's a devil here who has led him astray, tempted him. Same, strumpet I come, for of my heart those charms, thine eyes are blotted, thy bed lust stained, shall be with lust's blood be spotted. So we spoke about the marriage bed a little bit here in our previous lesson. This idea of the names, first of all, strumpet being another word for whore, for example, a curse towards her. Of my heart is stained, blotted, stained. Your eyes and charms are all blotted, are all stained to me. I can't feel them anymore. And your bed, stained with lust, i.e. the evidence or the sort of liquidity of sex, either the blood stains or the ejaculation there, is this idea of spotted with the blood of Desdemona's death as well. So he views this as poetic justice, because there's this idea of where you betrayed me, I will betray you by killing you. And I read that Iago is doubting whether his wife betrayed her as well. He decided to act differently. M11, to a certain extent, yes. So there is Iago also saying that he fears that Emilia and Othello have had an affair before. He does cite that as one of his reasons for getting revenge on Othello. Whether we believe it or not is up to you, but perhaps that's this idea that, is he actually unmotivated and just evil, or is he doing the same thing as Othello is here, but taking it out on Othello rather than Emilia? He does, of course, also kill Emilia, so in the end, he gets his way. So this idea then of him also thinking, well, your life is in my hands. Because you've insulted me, I will destroy you. And again, to be once in doubt is to be once to be resolved. So this idea of confirmation then, and taking it into his own hands, and then that I did proceed upon just grounds to this extremity. So he sees this as an extremity, but that he was just in pursuing this because she threatened his masculinity. Eliot, this is T.S. Eliot here, says, endeavouring to escape reality, he has ceased to think about Desdemona and is thinking about himself here. So, interestingly here, we have this idea that he doesn't actually care about Desdemona and what she's feeling, or if she loves him or not, but rather is worried about what this is doing for his own reputation. Greenblatt as well, saying, adultery was one of the most horrible of mortal sins, more detestable than homicide or plunder. So this idea that it's worse for him that she's adulterous than she's dead, or that he's dead, or that she's killed someone. Gardner says, Othello's soldiership is the symbol of his entire masculinity, and Desdemona's murder has the stamp of the heroic. The act is also heroic in its absoluteness, disinterestedness, and finality. It must be done. So this idea of him conquering and destroying this treasonous enemy, which makes sense because in Act 5, Scene 2, when he is giving his final speech, Othello talks about these traitors to Venice, who he punished here, and this idea that he is trying to kind of reconquer what was betrayed. So Desdemona becomes like Cyprus, right? An area to be controlled and conquered and met with violence if not. And he acts like a soldier in these scenes, in his determination, his forcefulness that this must happen. This is tactical for him. Jardine says Othello acts with complete certainty of Desdemona's guilt, because we don't see any questioning here, right? We see a lot of forceful, determined language. We see a lot of future tense and direct language. And Weigel says, Othello laments of himself, a horned man's a monster and a beast. This is, in his view, to lose control of the woman in his life is to lose everything that makes him human. In other words, without his honor, he sees himself in the same terms that the prejudiced character sees him, as an animal. And this makes sense because, again, in Act 5, Scene 2, we see him described as the circumcised dog, right? The base Indian, the malignant Turk, right? He views himself as these, to him, subhuman creatures who she has brought him to be, and thus why perhaps he says, damn her, etc., and feels justified in killing her. What else defines masculinity here? We have Iago saying, awake, what ho, Brabantio, thieves, thieves, look to your house, your daughter and your bags, thieves, thieves. Look at the alignment here. This is showing that masculinity has to do with possession. Here is, and with reputation, right? Othello also says, let him do his spite my services, which I've done the signori shall out-tongue his complaints, yet 'tis to know that when I know boasting is an honour, I shall promulgate. I fetch my life, my being from men of royal siege. My demerits may speak unbonneted as proud a fortune as this I have reached. So this idea of Othello not worrying about Brabantio because his reputation precedes him. His status in society precedes him. To get room is still meant a guilt, not bothering if it was right or not. M11, 100%. And Iago is full of revenge. Agreed. Yes, on both accounts. Cassio as well saying, reputation, reputation, reputation. Oh, I have lost my reputation. I have lost the immortal part of myself. What remains is bestial. One of the most key quotations of the play. Thinking of this as his reputation as being lost has made him bestial or beast-like. And he has lost his immortality. He's lost his soul. The part of him that's human is his reputation. Without it, he's nothing. Ludovico says, is this the noble Moor whom our full senate calls all in all sufficient? Is this the nature whom passion could not shake? Whose solid virtue the shot of accident nor dart of chance could neither graze nor pierce? So this idea then of Ludovico when he sees Othello in Cyprus being driven to this madness, says this can't possibly be the same person whose reputation was so good previously. What has happened to him? Can't possibly be. And again highlights how important this reputation is. The Senate of Venice supports him to a man. Example. Then Othello says, I took you for that cunning whore of Venice that married with Othello. You, mistress, that have the office opposite to Saint Peter and keep the gate of hell. I, you. We have done our course, here's money for your pains. I pray you, turn the key and keep our counsel. What does this gentleman conceive? How do you, madam? How do you, my good lady? Faith half asleep. This is the idea that Othello is saying, I thought you were that sex worker or prostitute who Othello is married to. So then sort of embodying this different voice from Othello in which he's saying that this is the voice kind of society. And he is this kind of solicitor of a prostitute saying, oh, I've heard that Othello's wife is a sex worker. Thought that was you, type of thing. So this idea then of him being really conscious of society's voice and embodying it himself in thinking about his reputation as married to someone tricky and promiscuous, and treating her then as this sex worker, and saying to Emilia, turn the key and keep our counsel, so keep this on the down low, in other words, and lock the doors. This idea of private versus public space that reveals Othello's fear of his reputation being damaged. And Ludovico, O thou Othello, who thou was once so good, fall in the practice of a cursed slave, what shall be said to thee? Why, anything. An honourable murderer, if you will, for naught I did in hate, but all in honour. So this idea then of thinking of Desdemona through this of Othello, sorry, not just Desdemona, through this juxtaposition between good and cursed slave, in terms of reputation then being so important, and Othello insisting that this is honourable, so showing then his value on honour, that he was trying to preserve his honour. Notice the repetition there of honour being important here. He didn't hate Desdemona, he did it to preserve his honour, and that seems justifiable to him. And Othello at the end, I've done the state some service, and they know it. No more of that. I pray you in your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am. So he's asking then, when they say they have to write to Venice to tell what's happened, to remove Othello from duty, obviously take him into custody, he's saying, remind them that I've actually done a lot of good things for them. Remind them of that in your letters when you say everything that just happened and what went down. So again, even his wife lying dead in front of him, knowing he's destroyed, about to commit suicide, he cares mostly about his reputation. Jardine says the portrayal of women in Othello is that of passive victims or deceivers of men. Here we can see the deceivers of men, right? Having tricked Brabantio, Othello, into something here. Philip saying, in his very first speech, he subconsciously acknowledges the social pressure he's under. Life for him is a game in which he does not know the rules. So this is thinking then about the pressure of his reputation and attempting to preserve it as an outsider here as well is key. So more precarious, as I've said. Marchitello says, military exploits are one way for men to build their honour. Primary means by which men define their honour is their ability to command the faithfulness of their women. So Othello has one and the other, and then loses one and then loses the other. So he is completely destroyed in terms of his honour, even as we see it's so important to him. Foister says, as John Dodd and Rober Cleaver explained in the conduct book they wrote in 1612, it is impossible for a man to understand how to govern the Commonwealth that does not know how to rule his own house. So this idea then that Othello's military reputation suffers even when he thinks he can't control his own household. Marchitello says, Othello claims to have thought a sacrifice will, he believes, rid him of his doubt, not about her fidelity, but about his status as an outsider. So this idea of him sacrificing Desdemona to preserve his status in society, but it doesn't work. Then, how does femininity appear in the play? We've got a couple of different ideas here. Emilia says, have we not affections, desires for sport, and frailty as men have? Emilia here being our kind of outspoken proto-feminist character, meaning feminist before feminism was really an idea, and thinking very similar to Shylock from Merchant of Venice, bringing women into this conversation and saying, well, don't we also have these same ideas as men, these same experiences as humans as men, or not? And this is interesting because she's the one who seems to see the sort of truth of things. She's the one that brings women onto a more level playing field by describing marital affairs and women having power within a marriage if they know how to wield it, if they know how to wield sex and beauty to their advantage. And this idea of her questioning, really speaking to her role as quite a subversive character. Desdemona saying, I do nothing but to please his fantasy. This is interesting. She says this saying, I don't do anything that's not specifically to please what he wants, so to please his desires. However, it's also interesting because this is then a reinforcement of Jacobean femininity, right? She is completely fulfilling the expectation of a Jacobean woman here by saying, I essentially live to serve my husband. It also perhaps is evidence of her deep love for her husband, but also through this word fantasy rather than desires, love, needs, etc. Speaks to this idea of appearance versus reality again, and the idealization and idolization of Desdemona and Othello here. Because Desdemona and Othello don't really know each other well, right? They don't know each other biblically at all, it seems, by the end of the play. They've also only been married for 2 days, most of which Othello isn't really talking to or being very nice to Desdemona. So this idea of her trying to fulfill his fantasy of what? Of her, of their relationship, etc. Does this then speak to, though this is in the earlier part of the play, is this speaking to, again, the fated nature of their relationship? Because maybe she idealizes him for his adventures, etc. Maybe he idealizes her for her purity and her insider status. And maybe this isn't suitable as a marriage. Love, you said, doesn't know the rules. Well said. Thank you. People never really know the rules of society. It's actually made up of each of the people that, so this idea of a social construct, right? Society is a social construct, but there are people who are more clued into these rules in specific societies, right? So all the Venetian nobility are insiders in this society, and Othello is very conscious that he doesn't know all of these rules of propriety and gentility because he was born somewhere else. But I see your, and I like your point. So very different then, Desdemona from Emilia, and very different as well from Bianca. Bianca says, I'm no strumpet, but of life as honest as you that thus abuse me. So interesting here, because Emilia and Desdemona don't like Bianca. They don't socialize with her because she would have been a corruptive influence on them. Them associating with her was them associating with a corruptible influence who would be bad for them. And when Emilia sort of dismisses her when they're in the same place, she defends herself and says, I'm not a strumpet, I'm not a sex worker or a prostitute. I am honest as you all who say I'm not, and you who abuse me. And interesting that she defends herself, because this is, again, a different kind of femininity than, for example, Desdemona is. Desdemona who is half fainting at even the language of sex work being used in front of her, whereas Bianca defends herself, and this kind of pulls apart this whole idea of her as a sex worker, because who is it who's telling us so? Othello, the liar, and Cassio, who doesn't treat her very well and idealizes Desdemona and treats her as a sex worker, seemingly because he can, because she is gettable for him, because she loves him, and thus he feels he can use her and dispose of her. Interesting, right, that she's treated that way. And here we have Desdemona with one idea of femininity here, this idea of idealized femininity, passivity, purity, etc. So here we have her saying, my noble father, I do perceive here a divided duty. To you I am bound for life and education. My life and education both do learn me how to respect you. You are the lord of duty. I am hitherto your daughter, but he is my husband. And so much duty as my mother showed to you, preferring you before her father, so much I challenge that I may profess you to the more, my lord. Couple of parts here that are interesting. this idea of duty and femininity between father and husband. This idea of being bound, so owing for this life and education. This idea of respect within that. And him, as the lord of duty. So this power dynamic that's established there. And I am your daughter. But then we have this contrast. But here's my husband. So much duty as my mother showed to you, preferring her before her father. So much I challenge that I may profess you to the more my lord. So she's saying, you're my father, but like my mother did for you, and preferred you over her father as part of the expectation. You're meant to love your husband and want to live with him more than you want to live with your father. Then I say the same. I am fulfilling being a good wife by wanting to be with my husband who I've married. And this idea of lord, right? Not that Desdemona isn't a lady, but this idea of my lord, this idea of power and control through these referential strategies here. Othello also says, "'Tis not to make me jealous, to say my wife is fair, feeds well, loves company, is free of speech, sings, plays, and dances. Where virtue is, these are more virtuous." So he's saying here, when Othello is being tempted by Iago into this doubt about Desdemona, he's saying all of these things, all of these virtues of hers are abundant, but actually that's cause for jealousy. Someone who is so desirable as Desdemona, it's likely that people will want to steal her away because she is so virtuous and so good. So it kind of makes her more vulnerable or more likely to be pursued by someone else in an adulterous fashion. And thus the good things, all of these positive things about Desdemona, her accomplishments of fulfilling, look at all of this whole list of Jacobean expectations for women, is actually to her detriment. It's a kind of catch-22 in which Desdemona is virtuous, so that makes her vulnerable to adultery, but also if she weren't virtuous, she is vulnerable to adultery, so she is stuck in between the two here. Cassio says, divine Desdemona. This epithet then speaks to her as this deified creature. Rodrigo says she's full of the most blessed condition. And Brabantio describes her as a maid so tender, fair, and happy. And all of these link her divinity and her idealization to her virginity and link her to this role as the Virgin Mary, for example. Othello says, but that I love the gentle Desdemona, I would not my unhoused free condition put into circumscription and confine for the sea's worth. So he wouldn't give up his freedom for the entire sea's worth of money. So again, thinking of her as this kind of exchange here, but that he loves her as well. This idea of her being gentle, for example, matches Jacobean expectations. And Desdemona, this is after he storms out, having accused her and yelled at her. "'Tis meet I should be used so, very meet. How have I behaved that he might stick the smallest opinion on my least misuse? What is your pleasure, madam? How is it with you? I cannot tell. Those that do teach young babes do it with gentle means and easy tasks. He might have chid me so, for in good faith I am a child to chiding. What is the matter, lady? Alas, Iago, my lord, hath so behawed her, thrown such despite and heavy terms upon her, that true hearts cannot bear it. Am I that name, Iago?" So here she is saying, I deserve this treatment, but doesn't understand why. She distrusts him, that she has done something wrong. So already we're thinking about the power dynamic and the passivity of that, right? The fact that she just implicitly trusts that what he is saying is correct, and that she has somehow failed here. She doesn't know about this, and she says she is a child, so She wished he had scolded her less harshly because she's not used to it, so it upsets her the way a child would be upset. And Emilia says, my lord hath so behawed her, has called her a whore, that true hearts, that honest hearts can't bear it. It's unbearable to hear Othello talk about Desdemona this way. And it seems that Desdemona, again, kind of defers to a man to answer this question, like, am I that name? She won't even say the name. Shows her innocence and purity, this idea that she's the embodiment of Jacobean femininity. And Othello, in our final scene, that whiter skin of hers than snow and smooth as monumental alabaster, a pearl richer than all his tribe. So the imagery of whiteness is so obvious here and clear with how she is idealized, this idea of her as deified, as a statue, as some kind of idol that he worships, as an object that he is thrown away. But this idea of innocence and virginity being paired with it. Jardine, in a quotation we've seen in a previous lesson, says, Desdemona is glorious in her resignation in the face of husbandly chastisement, and she shows exemplary passivity in adversity, becoming the embodiment of female passivity. So she is so passive in contrast to Othello. She hardly defends herself here. She seems confused as to anything, but she resigns herself that he's right. Weigel says it becomes clear that these two different ways of describing women don't actually apply to real women. They are male fantasies imposed on women. There we get the idealization and the idolization. Ideals that men want women to fulfill and roles that women therefore purposely play for men. For instance, Desdemona often describes her devotion to Othello in front of other people, underscoring that even though she does love him very deeply, she is a certain extent playing the role of the virtuous wife. So this idea of innocence, is it performed, is it real? This idea that she's trying to fulfill his fantasy to a certain extent. Coleridge says Othello feels moral indignation and regret that Desdemona's virtue has been destroyed. So here we have this idea that he is indignant at her very destruction because look how valuable and idealized she is. And Bradley says she can do nothing whatever. That makes sense with her responses here. She cannot retaliate even in speech. She is ardent with the courage and idealism of a saint, and her nature is infinitely sweet and her love is absolute. So as we spoke about on Wednesday, this idea of her as commending herself to her kind Lord, even in her death. Good point, M11. She does not obey her father, so not all that passive. Agreed. This idea that that's one argument, but then we can contrast it with ourselves in a different paragraph. How does femininity appear as well? This idea of the destruction here of this idolization and idealization. This is the whore of the Madonna-whore dichotomy here. So Iago says, so will I turn her virtue to pitch, pitch being black tar. So then again, highlighting this dynamic between the two. Virtue is white, pitch is black. And out of her own goodness, make the net that shall enmesh them all. So saying, I will manipulate her goodness to catch and ensnare all of them and destroy all of them. So then thinking of goodness as something that can be manipulated because he knows what will happen if it appears dirty and tarred. Othello also says, villain, be sure thou prove my love a whore. Be sure of it. Give me the ocular proof. So this idea then of these two linked together. This idea of him not even being sure of her infidelity yet, asking for proof, but already this language is coming out here of the Madonna-whore dichotomy. Othello also says, and notice the change and the shift in language here to prose as Othello loses control and speaks in this low way that it is different from his eloquent, beautiful phrasing at the beginning. I let her rot and perish and be damned tonight, for she shall not live. No, my heart is turned to stone. I strike it and it hurts my hand. Oh, the world hath not a sweeter creature. She might lie by an emperor's side and command him tasks. So this idea of the power of Desdemona as well in her sexuality, lying by a general or an emperor, thinking she has the power in her sexuality to cause the downfall of an emperor here because of her seeming innocence. So she has this kind of wily control over him. But she says, let her rot and perish. This idea of punishment. She deserves punishment here. And he says she shall not live. That forceful language that declares that her life is in his hands here. Iago then speaking to Emilia, be wise and get you home. This is when Emilia is saying, that's not what happened. Desdemona was innocent. You killed her. My husband had something to do with this, etc. It's all about to come out. Be wise and get you home. Draws his sword. I will not. Fie, your sword upon a woman. So Graziano saying, there's no way you're pulling a sword on a woman. Again, speaking to the power dynamic. It's not expected he pulls a sword on a woman because she's not expected to fight back. He's expected to protect her. So this subversion then of the role of a husband here. Emilia says, O thou dull Moor, the handkerchief thou speakest of, I found by fortune and did give my husband. He begged of me to steal it. Villainous whore. She give it to Cassio? No, alas, I found it and I did give it my husband. Filth thou liar. So look immediately at how Iago treats a woman who does not obey him. She's not done anything to him sexually as such. She's not cuckolded him in this moment. But look at the response to women who are defiant here, particularly wives who are defiant. Calls her filth and villainous whore. So this idea of disobedient women and the violence and punishment that awaits them. Similarly here, I'd be happy if the general camp, as we looked at in our last lesson, pioneers and all had tasted her sweet body than keep a corner in the thing I love for others' uses. So I'd rather the entirety of my army had sex with her and I didn't know about it than me only being able to control one tiny part of her, or one part of her particularly sexually. So then this idea of her as an object, her as something to be consumed, her as something that is unhuman and dehumanized, this kind of portioning out and sort of vile fantasy of his, of all of his whole army having sex with her. Desdemona as well, alas, what sin, ignorant sin have I committed? Fellow, was this fair paper, this most goodly book, made to write whore upon? What committed? Committed? O thou public commoner, I should make very forges of my cheeks, that would to cinders burn up modesty. Did I but speak thy deeds. What committed? Impudent strumpet. Turn thy complexion there, patience, thou young and rose-lipped cherubin. I there look grim as hell. I hope my noble lord esteems me honest. O I, as summer flies are in the shambles, that quicken even with blowing. O thou weed, which art so lovely fair, and smellest so sweet, that the sense aches at thee, would thou hadst never been born. By heaven you do me wrong. Are you not a strumpet? So here Desdemona is saying, what have I done unknowingly? He says, is this paper, this book, he's saying her face, has it got the word whore written on it? Has it been contaminated with this writing here over it? Essentially, I'm looking at your face that's so beautiful. Is it revealing that you're a whore? Committed, like, what have you done? My cheeks would burn with shame, would burn up to cinders if I even spoke about what you've done. How dare you even suggest that you haven't done it? Turn your complexion there. So essentially, let me see your face. You angel, you should be looking grim as hell. Your face should reflect your evil doing. And then I hope my lord esteems me honest. He says, oh yeah, like summer flies kind of covering something diseased, etc. Essentially, no, I don't. And calls her a weed. So something that smells sweet, but shouldn't be there or is wrong in some way. I wish you were never born. It would have been better if you hadn't been. She says, by heaven, you do me wrong. Are you not a strumpet? So this idea then of her trying to defend herself, a little bit transgressive then, but also this idea of him feeling completely justified in this because thinking that he deserves to treat her this way because of her infidelity. As we said, Jardine says that Othello acts with complete certainty of her guilt. Lumba says there are only 3 women in Othello: Bianca, who's treated as a whore, Desdemona, who's repeatedly accused of being one, and Emilia, who's dismissed as her bawd, and also called a whore by her husband. So this idea then of this is the only treatment of women, this is the anxiety of men, and this is whenever women step out of line, this is the response to that. Traub says male anxiety towards female erotic power is channeled into a strategy of containment, which means that men are so worried about women's sexuality that they try to contain and control it here because they're afraid it will damage their reputation. Breitenberg says, again, male fantasies imposed on women. That's here, right? Not just the positives, but also this image of, oh, she's cheating on me, and this projection of their own insecurities onto these innocent women. Anxiety of men, 11, yeah. Talking about it so badly, it makes you angry. Agreed. Martitello, marriage in which power relations could be negotiated and challenged, as well as adopted and accepted. So this idea of marriage as this place where power dynamics start to shift, where perhaps Desdemona can try and defend herself here and here, and where Emilia stands up for herself. So there is slightly more power here when she does speak out then. Newman says, femininity is not opposed to blackness and monstrosity, but to be identified with the monstrous. An identification that makes miscegenation doubly fearful. So Newman says that for the Jacobeans, femininity is aligned with monstrosity because a woman who is deceitful is destructive and causes someone's downfall, is evil, and the women who can hide it and thus get away with it are even more monstrous because they're able to drag and seduce men along with it. We also have this idea then of miscegenation. So not only is there this monstrousness of blackness, there's also this monstrousness of femininity. So paired together, we have this doubly transgressive union. And then Bloom, finally, Emilia's heroic victory over Iago is one of Shakespeare's grandest ironies, appropriately consummates the play's most surprising moment. So this idea that Emilia stands up to her husband and reveals the whole thing here is surprising because Jacobean women were not expected to do this. And even as she said, she gives the handkerchief to her husband. So she is then fulfilling Jacobean expectations that say to obey your husband, but she also defies them in this final moment and thus redeems herself. Here as well, we have the sororal bonds. We've looked at this before, this idea of Desdemona and Emilia having a sisterly bond. And we've seen this before as well. Emilia saying that she stakes her soul and lays down her life on the fact that Desdemona is honest. And if she is not chaste and pure, then no man is happy. So in other words, she is as good as they get. And the same with her at the end. Gratiano says, the woman falls, sure he hath killed his wife. Oh, lay me by my mistress's side. So this idea that she wants to be with Desdemona in the last. She betrays Iago, supposedly, because she gives up his scheme rather than staying silent as he ordered. And he sacrifices her to escape, essentially, and punishes her for her speaking out, for her defiance. But she wants to be with Desdemona. So really they are brought together in death and they die together. And Emilia says, more she was chaste, she loved thee, cruel more, so comes my soul to bliss as I speak true. We've seen these two quotations in a previous lesson. But this idea of her defending Desdemona to her dying breath and thus making this trajectory here linear, right? She is consistently defending Desdemona and is the only one. Neely says, the central theme is love, and Emilia, its most explicitly speaks to this theme, recognizes the central conflict and inherits from the heroines of comedy the role of potential mediator. She's dramatically and symbolically the play's fulcrum. And there have been, particularly for AQA questions, there have been questions specifically on Emilia. So it's important to think of her, though she's not one of the three major characters, as still important here. And O'Leary says, this female alliance as a tool of resistance against the power of destructive violence is starkly contrasted with the male unwillingness to take any personal risk in order to help victims of violence. So this idea of all of the male characters do not intervene when Othello is angry, slapping Desdemona and killing her. Emilia dies for Desdemona and is in an alliance with her that resists this violence by saying that they are united in death. She's my mistress, we are together, in a way that the men do not do, even though they're meant to be the protectors. Then we have Bianca. And Bianca here, we're thinking about with a different alternative perspective as well. So again, for AQA, where this is on the Love Through the Ages paper, we're thinking about this theme of love and characters or relationships, and characters like Bianca are helpful for a paragraph to provide an alternative perspective, right? Because then you have this sort of ready paragraph in which you're able to put Bianca as a contrast to characters like Desdemona and Emilia, but also perhaps somewhat in alignment with someone like Othello, or with Othello's projection onto Desdemona of who she is, because she is treated very differently. She is an outsider, and her trajectory is supposed to be comedic, but also there is something here about people not fulfilling these tenets of femininity. I think it's actually relevant to society today. That's even scary. M11, 100%. That's why Shakespeare is still relevant after 400 years, if you can believe it. Bianca says, leave you. Wherefore, I do attend here on the general, and think it no addition, nor my wish, to have him see me womaned. Why, I pray you, not that I love you not, but that you do not love me. I pray you bring me on the way a little, and say if I shall see you soon at night. 'Tis but a little way that I can bring you, for I attend here, but I'll see you soon. 'Tis very good, I must be circumstanced. Here, Cassio has said, go away now, to Bianca, who's trying to talk to him. She's followed him from Venice to Cyprus, by the way, because she's in love with him. And he's saying, go away, leave me alone. She says, why? Because the general, Othello, is coming here, and I don't want him to see me with you, with a sex worker, with a woman here. She said, why? Not that I don't love you, but that you don't love me. Come with me a little bit, like walk a little ways with me, and tell me if you'll see me at night. Interesting. Would a Desdemona-esque character see a man at night who's not her husband? Certainly not. So this is one of the implications that she's a sex worker, because if she's seeing her at night, then this is not fitting in with the expectations of polite society, so her reputation is bad. And I can only walk you a little way because I'm waiting here, so I'm not going to walk you, but I'll see you soon. And she says, okay, good. I must essentially make my peace with that circumstance here. So this idea then of the power dynamic between the two, what's implied about Bianca. Bianca's name, by the way, translates to white. So is that irony that she is not the epitome of purity that someone like Desdemona is, and Desdemona, demon, this kind of play with purity and impurity and transgression here. But then this idea of, again, she has to submit to what men want. I'll have to make do with that because that's all you're going to give me, essentially. And Iago also says, This is to himself. Now I will question Cassio of Bianca, a housewife that by selling her desires buys herself bread and clothes. It is a creature that dotes on Cassio, as 'tis the strumpet's plague to beguile many and be beguiled by one. He, when he hears of her, cannot refrain from the excess of laughter. Here he comes. Okay. Housewife, one of two things. A housewife, but also perhaps a play on words for hussy, which is another word for a sex worker. By selling her desires to buy bread and clothes. So here he is saying she's a sex worker. And notice, a creature that dotes on Cassio. So look at the language here used to describe her. So essentially, a creature who loves Cassio, and it's the plague of the strumpets. But interesting, we've got disease there as well. With a character of sex work, that would be the implication, is that they're diseased both morally and physically because they might have an STI. Because, of course, there weren't the kinds of medicines to prevent those or the kind of measures to prevent those at the time. So it's the strumpet's plague. It is the sex worker's plague or problem to beguile many, to make many people in love with them, but then fall in love with one person and only want that one person. When he hears of her, he can't refrain from laughter. So Cassio, talking about her, laughs about her all the time. So this idea of mockery with her as well. And Iago sort of thinking of this idea of this cheap shots of jokes about her, etc., that speaks to her reputation and the status of women in society. Cassio, in this conversation, in which Othello, listening, thinks that Cassio is talking about Desdemona, but Cassio is actually talking about Bianca, and Iago says, "Oh, I heard she said you're going to marry her," and he says, "I marry her. What? A customer? Prithee, bear some charity to my wit. Do you not think it so unwholesome? Ha ha ha. This is the monkey's own giving out. She is persuaded I will marry her out of her own love and flattery, not out of my promise. She was here even now. She haunts me in every place. I was the other day talking on the sea bank with certain Venetians, and thither comes the bauble, and by this hand she falls me thus about my neck." So here she's saying, what, me, a customer, marry a sex worker? I don't think so. I'm just a customer here. So this idea then of transaction in a different way than with Desdemona, but also in the same way she's described in Act 1, right? As someone who's making the beast with two backs, as all of that graphic sexual imagery from the jump. And then this idea of, be kinder to me than that. Don't imply that I'm so stupid as to try and marry a sex worker. By thinking she's in love with me, or thinking I'm in love with her just because she lets me have sex with her, essentially. Don't think me as so unwholesome. So this really shows the Madonna-whore dichotomy, right? He wouldn't dream of marrying Bianca because she's immoral to him. She's beneath him. She's the whore who doesn't deserve to be married. He would want to marry someone like Desdemona, who's pure, while still being able to engage with Bianca on the side for his thrills. He calls her the monkey. So again, the power dynamic, the dehumanization there. She's persuaded I'll marry her, but that's because she's fooled herself into thinking that. In other words, I didn't promise her that. Again, think about how an unmarried, sexually active woman would be treated in the Jacobean era. She'd be an outcast in society. This was very common that a man would promise to marry a woman, have sex with her before they got married, and then leave her. And then the woman would be ruined, and the man presumably would be fine and would be able to get out of it saying, oh, she tricked me, she deceived me, she caused me she tempted me, to use Emma Levin's phrasing. And then she haunts me and everything, so she's following me around everywhere. I was talking on the sea bank with Venetians. That suggests that they are important. So the generals like Othello, the elite here. And here comes this sex worker walking up to me, this bauble, so this decoration, like a Christmas bauble decoration, and she is hanging around my neck, and how embarrassing, essentially. So this idea then of her being shameful, a shameful association for him, which is why he wants her out of the way when Othello comes in the first quote up there as well. And etc. At the end of the scene, Iago says, she comes back, handkerchief throws at him, says, I'm not doing this work for you. have your other person you're sleeping with who gave it to you do it. It's not for me. And Iago says, after her, I must, else she'll rail in the street else. So it's the idea that she will proclaim that I'm sleeping with her and I've done wrong by her. And he doesn't care about her. He wants to preserve his reputation here, the same way as here and here. And Honigman says, one wonders whether the men are capable of unselfish love. It doesn't seem like it, based on these scenes in particular, right? That love for them is about reputation and is about status and power and sex, but not about the women they're actually with. And Jardine says, the portrayal of women in Othello, is that of passive victims or deceivers of men? So again, we have kind of both here. This bauble who seduces him and embarrasses him, or the victims like Desdemona. And this brings us to one of the ways we could see this included in an essay. So, for example, if your question is on reputation, what ideas could you bring in from masculinity and femininity? Well, perhaps something like the idea for the first one about Othello's reputation at the beginning as the epitome of masculine power and strength. Right? That's why he's not worried. We could also think, for example, of Desdemona's reputation at the beginning. But this being damaged by her marriage, as she's contaminated by the sooty bosom and the old black ram tupping her wayu, etc. We could also think about a paragraph in which Othello's true fear or true anxiety is his loss of reputation. And this could be a paragraph where we think about his reaction to the cuckoldry, the violence, his insecurity, etc., because this is what he's worried about. We could also think of Desdemona's fall to the whore in Othello's eyes. And how that reaction takes place. This idea of violence, objectification, his incoherence, that I'll tear her to pieces, I'll tear her all to messes, I'll chop her to messes, etc. All of that violence. I have no wife, all of that. And the fact that this really proves that his initial love was actually idolization. The voice a bit low. Oh, M11, I'm sorry. I can move the microphone a little bit closer, but it's nothing else has changed, I don't think. And then the tragic consequences of reputation. So looking at Othello's final speech, looking at Desdemona's murder, looking at Othello becoming a monster in order to preserve his reputation. Similarly, we could also look at a paragraph in which Iago's perfect reputation is what allows him to control Othello, so him being honest Iago, or Iago's knowledge of reputation being a way to manipulate people. Also thinking about Emilia as defending Desdemona and the strength of the sororal bond as the only attempt to defend Desdemona's reputation, or about Bianca's reputation really defining that other element of femininity here. Okay. Right, this brings us to the end of our lesson. Thank you so much for all of your contributions. M11, you're in particular a star for all of your comments today. Well done. I hope you found this helpful. Feel free to put any other questions in the comments below. Our next lesson will be on Wednesday at 6:50 until 8:20. I look forward to seeing you there for more Othello. For now, bye and see you later.